Now we can talk about running across the lifespan. And so running has a slightly different definition than walking, in the sense that it's 50% phasing between the legs with alternating periods of flight and single leg support. So again, if you wanted to try running a few steps, you would notice that 50% of the time you are in the air, that would be the flight period, and the other 50% of the time you are on one leg. So if you think about the definitions of walking to running, the progression, or if you're thinking in terms of motor milestones, right, the progression makes sense that you need to be able to walk before you can run, right? Because walking includes double support phase, which is generally considered more stable than single support phases, and running is just alternating single leg support phases, right? So what might we notice in early running? Usually early running starts about 6 to 7 months after walking starts, and typically we see walking start towards the end of the first year of life. I think we presented like 11 months, maybe 10 months, right? But generally 11 months to just after the first year is when walking starts. I think for me, my mom said I started walking at 10 months old. So again, individual variability, but we kind of keep it that universality concept where generally we would expect, right, these timelines. So 6 to 7 months after walking starts. And I think in our previous lecture, I had commented that sometimes movement or motor milestones are themselves rate limiters for motor milestones that occur after, right? And it's because you're introducing a new situation. So an individual might progress from early to proficient walking, and then when they get to early running, some of the characteristics that were present in early walking are going to resurface because, again, we kind of took out that double support phase and are now just focusing on single support in terms of how dynamic balance is happening. So you're going to see rigid arm and leg movements again, right? The rear leg typically doesn't fully extend like you might see in a proficient runner. The arm swings are kind of irregular, so you can see this little dude. His arms are kind of all over the place. They don't really have a specific pattern in terms of being close to the body or alternating in a coordinated way. Generally, we see that arms swing outwards to the side rather than front and back. Okay, so that's what this letter B in the figure is showing. And arms typically stay in high guard, right? So if they're moving in an outward direction, they stay on one level more or less, right? And we also see short strides, similar to the early walking characteristics. So that means rate limiters are going to be fairly similar and specific to the skill, right? So they need to have the ability to propel their body into the air. If you think about it, running is just basically a series of leaps, right? You're just jumping from one leg to the other. There's a slightly different coordination pattern, but they need to have the muscular strength, right, to push their body up into the air. They also need to have balance during the landing phase, right? Because different from walking, you have no support prior to when the next heel strike occurs. So they need to be able to have that ability to dynamically balance coming from or when the altering height of their body in space. As we practice early running skills, you'll see progression in characteristics. So again, we have the shift from stability to mobility, and you'll see very, very similar progressions from early running to proficient running as we saw from early walking to proficient walking, right? So we're going to increase the stride length. That's showing our adaptability to control our center of mass better. But also it could be strength related, where we're able to propel ourselves further in space as well, right? You'll see more planar movement, and that's more or less with kind of like the whole body, if you will. I have a note down, a couple dots down or bullets down, that you have opposing arm swinging, which goes front to back, added trunk rotation. But in terms of the arm swinging, planar movement just means that their legs and their arms are all moving in the same plane. So we have a concentration in the sagittal plane, right, where we're just flexing and extending in both our arms and our legs, versus where in early running they would have their arms out to the side, which is more of a frontal plane movement. Okay, they're going to have a narrower base of support, and then, as I had just touched on, they'll have more trunk rotation, largely due to the increased stride length. They'll also have a heel to toe pattern at the heel strike, and the back leg should fully extend. I think in terms of the book examples, they show this as this phase, the propulsive phase, where you're pushing off. Now, they say fully extends, but I mean, as you can see in the photo, there's still a little bit of flexion. So I think the better way to describe this, if you want to kind of expand, like saying back leg fully extends, I think is completely fine. But I feel like a better way of describing it is that they reach full hip extension, because generally when you observe locomotor patterns, I mean, even if it's walking versus running, the legs rarely extend fully to, like 0 degrees or 0 degrees of extension. So just a side note, okay? But the pattern should become more coordinated overall, and again, it becomes refined as individual constraints change. So introduce an injury, can't run anymore, right? And then you recover from the injury, you redevelop the running skill. And it's not like you start at baseline. It's more or less like when you learn how to ride a bike, it always stays with you, type of thing. But changes after running is considered proficient are very small, up until, again, later adulthood. Okay, so patterns are going to end up shifting from mobility to stability, and maintaining balance within those stable conditions. So I have a video of an older gentleman running on a track, and you can see that the patterns are very different from the Forrest Gump example that I showed in the previous slide, right? So again, we're going to see decreases in stride length. The number of steps also changes. So if you look at a particular distance, older adults will take more steps in that distance than a proficient runner might in earlier stages of life. And this is, again, probably mostly due to the stride length. Older adults also have decreases in range of motion. This could be due to a couple of factors. One could be their joint structure. Right, as we age, think aging of tissues concept, some of the components of your joint capsule deteriorate, making actually moving joints, which are your axis of rotation, right? It makes moving joints harder, or more difficult. But also we have, decreased physical activity, which can cause a decrease in flexibility, in terms of muscular flexibility, at least, not passive flexibility. We could also have decreases in passive flexibility too, but if you think about muscles being actively stretched, they're not going to be able to go as far. Also, we'll see decreases in speed. Okay, so again, you're not going to see a lot of older people running marathons. Maybe this guy does. He seems like he's pretty fit. And then I also want to comment on rate limiters in later running, or rate controllers. So we can consider balance and strength. I gave some good examples just now on things that could potentially affect range of motion, right? But balance, or being able to control their equilibrium in alternating single stance phases, might be something that they need to be able to do in order to perform running. But also another rate controller is ability versus choice. And I want to highlight this one, is that some people might be able to run. Like they physically are capable. They're not wheelchair bound. They don't need assisted devices, right? But they choose not to run. So that's actually a rate controller for me, right? I have the ability to run, but I don't run. I don't like running. I have terrible cardio endurance. If you put me on a bike, I can ride like 20 miles out the gate, pretty easy, no big deal. But running, I get shin splints like after running a quarter mile on flat ground. So, it's like I choose not to because it's not comfortable for me. So I think that's more or less a difference between physical capacity versus a behavioral decision, but it can impact if a person runs or not. Okay. Also, regular exercise can delay some changes in individual constraints, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester when we get into different body systems and how they age. But I think later in the semester we'll talk about a guy. He signed himself up to be a part of a case study and was measured every so often. I think there was like a large array of characteristics that were measured, like VO2, his blood pressure, resting heart rate, different muscular characteristics. I think he had MRI scans done to look at connective tissue health, etc. And then after he died, he donated his body for a cadaver study, and they reassessed what his tissues were like just after he passed away. And I mean, this guy, I think he ran like a crazy amount of miles every day, rarely took days off, and I think he died in his late 90s. He was close to 100 if I'm remembering correctly, but he delayed a lot of the aging processes just by staying active. So, physical activity, you guys. I think quarantine is interfering with that for a lot of us, but regular exercise or just being physically active, it could be as much as walking around the block every day or something, can help delay some regular aging individual constraints related to aging that we see later in the lifespan.